Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Suddenly I'm a Leader webinar. We are joined by our presenter this evening, Vicky Moriarty, and we also are joined by Anne Davis, who is the manager of RACGP, New South Wales and ACT, and my name is Samantha and I will be your host. Before we get started, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. We recognise the traditional custodians of the land and sea on which we live and work, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm just going to take you through a little bit of housekeeping quickly so you know how to interact with us and your control panel this evening. So you should all see a control panel appear as a black bar at the bottom of the shared presentation screen. If you can't see that bar, just take your cursor and hover it over the bottom of the shared presentation and that control panel should pop up. So that has your audio settings, your raise hand function, and most importantly, where you can answer, send us your questions, sorry. Everybody has been placed on listen only mode. This is to make sure that learning isn't disrupted by any background noise. As I said though, there is a questions box there and we do encourage you to send us your thoughts and comments and questions as we make our way through. As we do make our way through, we will be posing some questions for you to respond to as well. I am going to hand over to Anne Davis now, who is going to introduce Vicky for us.
Thanks, Samantha. Although it sounds a bit odd calling you Samantha. Thank you, Sammy. So thank you very much for everyone that's joined us this evening. This particular webinar is in response to a few GPs that contacted me and pretty much saying, suddenly I'm a leader and I'm really drowning. I don't know what's expected of me. So the fact that over 200 of you have joined us this evening shows that you are not alone. So our speaker this evening is Vicky Moriarty, and she's the newly appointed Head of Leadership Development at RACGP. But many of you are probably familiar with her and her role with the Future Leaders program. So I'm very much looking forward to this session. We have decided that this session will just be a short 30 minutes, less my speaking time. And after that, we'll actually ask you to just give your thoughts on, is there more that you would like? And two basic questions. First one is what topics, what things that you would like to talk about or hear about or learn about? And then the second question is what mode you would like to have that, that education and training in, podcast, webinars, virtual meetups, or whatever options that you might think of. So that's enough from me. Let's go over to Vicky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. So thank you very much for the invite and to join you all tonight. I work for the national office, although I'm based in Perth, as we're all remote workers now. And the work that I do is primarily delivering as a facilitator and essentially a teacher on leadership development. And my focus since I've been in Australia since 2006 has been working in general practice. So I've had the benefit of working alongside GPs in terms of setting up clinics, running clinics, recruiting staff, and also working alongside people in committee and board roles as I've been in the RACGP for the past 5 years. What I'd like to do is explore some of the key topics around leadership tonight. And we're going to look very briefly at the development of leadership as a field in itself. We're going to talk about learning to lead fast. We're going to look at 2 different scenarios, which you might find familiar. And then we're going to have brief time for Q&A and also just pointed to a few more resources. So the first thing is just to give you a timeline of the development of leadership. So during the 19th century, we saw the emergence of great man theory, where the concept of leaders being born was really a driver of the field of leadership. And gradually over time, prior to the Second World War and then during and after, there was a significant focus on leadership behaviours and traits, so personality traits. And the idea was that some people would be perhaps task versus, and others would be relationship focused. And this led to the concept of essentially adapting your leadership style later down the track according to the situation. So you may have heard of theorists like Blake and Moton, who developed the managerial grid, which was one grid according to concern for people and the other to concern for results. And then you would position yourself according to the situation in which you're working. Now, this became somewhat challenging because, as I'll touch on slightly later, what it meant was the leader was having to adapt their own style and not necessarily being authentic to themselves, which can create internal conflict when it comes to values. So as leadership theory progressed into the 1970s, transformational leadership really emerged very strongly. And that was in response to transactional leadership. So transactional leadership is essentially in return for your support or your vote, I will give you this in return. That might be a promotion. It might be freeze on taxes. So the idea is reciprocal, you give me something for something else, and we both benefit from that relationship. Transformational leadership was really about how do you engage followers to work in a unified direction in order to create change. And to do that effectively, you need to nurture the group of followers that you have as a leader. And the leader is essentially then out in front advocating for change. And one of the things that has come up as a criticism of this approach is that it places the leader to some extent as the hero of the situation because they are out in front. So since that transformational leadership approach emerged, and it's still very much present, we have moved into a domain known as authentic leadership, also servant leadership. There's other domains such as spiritual leadership as well. But for the purposes of this discussion, what I'm going to focus on is an element of authentic leadership, which is values-based. And the reason that I'm going to talk about that is when we were designing the Future Leaders Program, which has been running for 4 years, one of the most significant discussion points was, I as a GP have been told by virtue of the profession that I occupy what my values are or what they should be. And I feel somewhat at sea. I don't know what my individual values are because I've never had the opportunity to explore them. So we made this the basic tenet of the competency framework that we built in order to support leadership development within the Future Leaders Program. And what that does is it allows us as individual leaders to connect to who we are and what our drivers are and what we will seek to create as leaders. And in the 2 scenarios that I'm going to explore in a moment, I'll talk about formal and informal scenarios. But when we are driven by values, which most of us are, we have a tendency to reward and punish what we value. What we reward and what we punish as leaders creates organizational culture. So the way that we do things around here. Authentic leadership has been expanded upon by Bill George in 2003. And it's extraordinary to think that's nearly 20 years ago. But essentially, there are a number of domains that constitute authentic leadership. And each of those domains, if you focus on them as a leader, creates a very robust, very resilient leader. That is the theory. If you look at these domains as if you're suddenly a leader, this can seem somewhat daunting. So what is a better approach is to focus on one element. And again, for example, values and the values that drive your behaviors is a great starting point. Because what happens is you're then focusing on your own self-awareness. How do you engage with other people? How do they respond to you in return? And what are the results of that interaction? So this is very much around emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is a field that has been highly promoted by Daniel Goleman. There are critics of that field as well, but fundamentally, what you're looking at is that self-awareness, awareness of your impact on others, and the way in which you engage with people moving forward, but fundamentally empathy. The other feature of leadership that we explore is compassionate leadership. And this is particularly relevant to general practice for obvious reasons. You're required in engaging with patients to exercise compassion in those interactions. But what happens when you're working with your colleagues, with the practice management staff, if you're on a committee, if you're on a board, for example? How do you exercise the same compassion? Are you experiencing compassion fatigue? Do you need to reconnect with the concept of leading from the heart? And how do you do that? So what we talk about in terms of leadership is we're not looking for heroes. Very much the history of leadership has been focused on heroes and saving the people around us to a degree. And that can be somewhat unhealthy in the dynamic it creates. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in terms of the drama triangle. But for the purposes of this exercise, what we're looking at is, if you're a robust leader, you are equipping yourself with the knowledge. You have the clinical knowledge and the clinical competence and the experience that goes with it. As a leader, you're then looking to augment your skills by immersing yourself in the different skills that are applicable to the domain in which you're working. So general practice, is it, for example, the domain of advocacy? Do you advocate for your patients as you do as part of a requirement of the profession day to day? And do you need to create larger scale change in order to move things forward? What does that mean? What are the models that you can apply in that context? And how do you engage with other people? So how do you create a shared leadership approach? Now, I'm referencing all of these different compassionate leadership, shared leadership, values-based leadership, authentic leadership. There are over 200 definitions of leadership that have emerged. So one of the things that you need to do is really think about your own circumstances and your own needs when you are suddenly a leader. So the scenario that I'm just going to look at now is an informal one. And that might be that there are problems in your practice. This is something that has come up regularly throughout the conversations in the leadership programs that we've been running over the past few months. So there are problems in my practice. I'm not a partner, or you may be a partner, and everyone is turning to me. What do I do? Now, you're welcome to jump in with questions and comments at this point. If there's anything that you want me to pivot on in terms of what this means for you, I'm really happy to respond to those questions. But what we're seeing is, as a consequence of the stresses that have emerged throughout COVID, is GPs in the practice who are seen as a source of trust, who have built relationships very strongly in the practice, are suddenly required to help navigate some of the conflict that's emerging or some of the confusion. So what do you do in that situation? One of the things that is particularly useful to consider is, in this situation, the ladder of inference. So you haven't had the opportunity to do the groundwork all the time on what are my values? What does this mean in terms of how the interactions that I'm doing? So, but being aware of this particular consideration, the ladder of inference was developed by Chris Agiris and included in The Fifth Discipline by Peter Singer in 1990. So that's the name of the book. This ladder, the steps in it occur very quickly in people's thinking. So in an interaction with somebody, you're observing in that interaction, you're observing body language, you're listening to the words that they're using, and you're then selecting from that. So you can't possibly absorb everything in terms of every single bit of data that you're faced with day in, day out. And you then add meanings based on your personal experience, based on cultural experiences that will be different, obviously, from culture to culture. And then we will add assumptions based on those meanings. And from those assumptions, we can draw conclusions about where people are heading in terms of their decision making or what the rationale is behind their response to a situation. And then we adopt a belief about that person. This becomes a reinforcing reflexive loop. So each time we interact with that person, we will seek out the same data inadvertently in order to reinforce that. And then we may take actions based on those beliefs. So what you want to do as a leader is gather information first. Give yourself the space to breathe, i.e. the space to think. And for each person, that will be different. Is it 2 minutes in front of your computer in which you are simply breathing in and out for 6 seconds, in for 6 seconds and out for 6 seconds for 2 minutes to give yourself the space? Is it going for a walk in nature? Is it having a coffee catch up virtually on Zoom with a peer? Is it spending time with your kids? For each person, giving yourself that space to breathe is vital, because what it will do, it will allow you to process the information that you have been receiving and reflect on it, and then act. So what you're being potentially driven to do in this informal example is to make decisions very quickly. But what you want to do is give yourself as much space as you possibly can to absorb the information, reflect on the different scenarios that are unfolding in front of you, and some of the relationship dynamics too. Do we have any questions, Samantha, before I move on to the next point?
There's nothing that's come through yet. If any pop up relevant to what you're speaking to, I will jump in and let you know.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful. Okay. So active listening, I am absolutely certain that this is something that you have had hammered home your entire careers. It's a good reminder though. Active listening, and this particular model is created by the Centre for Creative Leadership. It's a great source of resources for leadership. This active listening model, when you are seeking information before you're then going into that space to be able to think and before you act, includes being attentive. So being attentive in the moment. That's not just listening with your head, it's full body listening, which I've discovered they're actually promoting in Kindy at the moment, because my son keeps coming home for full body listening stickers, which he's very proud of. So being attentive, asking open-ended questions, asking probing questions, requesting clarification, paraphrasing, and then, if I can get the mouse to work, being attuned to and reflecting feelings. So is what you're seeing and how you're interpreting it what's actually happening? And then summarizing back to the other person. Now, I'm looking at this model in the context of you being asked in an informal capacity to lead somehow on possibly driving change within the practice. And this is a very good way to confirm what it is that you're seeing, hearing, and feeling and experiencing directly from the other person. So EQ, as defined by Daniel Goleman, so this is that domain of emotional intelligence, requires that degree of self-awareness, self-regulation, your own motivation, building empathy. And you build empathy by working with people in a way that is attentive, asking those open-ended questions and engaging in the active listening process, and then using those social skills to elicit more information. In this environment, potentially the self-regulation part is one of the most challenging areas. So we recognize this in terms of leadership development. So what do you use in order to give yourself that space? So it's a reminder of that creating that space to breathe is really, really important. One of the things that can arise in these informal and formal scenarios is that it's drama triangle that can be created, where we have people occupying the role of persecutor, rescuer, or victim. And invariably, there is someone where a scenario is being related to you, where someone's occupying the persecutor role, someone's occupying the rescuer role, or you may be required to occupy the rescuer role. And the victim in it is describing all of these situations. So you'll probably hear this with patients as well, but from a workplace perspective, if you are in this informal situation and you don't have the authority to create change, to mandate action, thinking about the role of rescuer and you being placed into that role, are you actually required to do that? Invariably, you're not. So what can you do in order to elicit a different response from the person who might be occupying the victim role and create change for them in terms of who they see as the persecutor? And one of the ways that you can do that is to ask coaching style questions. So asking them, what have they considered in their approach? Have they considered the viewpoint of the other person? And obviously, depending on the emotion that's riding with it, you'd have to move through that step by step. There is a whole approach to doing this in terms of coaching skills in the workplace. But avoiding this drama triangle helps you also to create that space for yourself in suddenly being a leader. So in the formal scenarios, what we're hearing and seeing a great deal throughout the leadership development that we do with GPs is that role, being given a role, a formal role in a committee, a PHN, a local board, and knowing that you have responsibilities. So questions that come up might be, what are those responsibilities and where do I focus first? So what I would do is, in this situation, is connect with people on the board before you get into the room, or the committee, or the PHN. Is there an induction process for that committee, PHN, or local board? And gather as much information as you can. So to quickly go back to that previous slide, in which we had Leading Fast as the title, so gathering information before you get in the room. And then when you arrive, just before you arrive in the room, give yourself some space. Quite often what we find is we're on the phone before we go into a meeting, we're straight off the call into a meeting, and you're being required to multitask constantly in general practice. And that's a huge pressure. So even if you give yourself the space to breathe of 2 minutes before you go into the room, or however long it is, that allows you to show up in a way that is more active listening than otherwise. And so gather information on what the requirements of the role are. There may be, for example, the RACGP has a representatives guidebook if you're formally appointed as a representative of committee that you can refer to. So understand what your responsibilities are, and then look for where you can get support and information internally in the organisation that you're connected to. Obviously, if it's a board, then in an ideal world, you want to be able to be given some understanding of what your fiduciary duties are, etc. So connecting to what the AICD offers in terms of governance for directors is really valuable too. But focusing first on what the dynamics are in the room, what the information is that's being shared, and what your purpose is of being in the room. Are you there as a GP representative? Are you representing a particular group? And how do you build relationships with other people in the room in order to be able to move forward effectively as a leader? One of the consistent topics that comes up is feeling imposter syndrome before you get in the room. In order to tackle imposter syndrome, this is a whole topic in itself. In order to tackle imposter syndrome, I'm sure that many of you will be experienced in the need to understand by gathering information. So whatever scenario that is, going in confidently is going in equipped with the information about the situation that you're facing, or gathering information in the room. That would be my first recommendation. I know that quite often where you're dealing with senior medical doctors, specialists, that can also be a driver. So what I would also recommend, again, to reinforce, is taking that space before you go into the room to connect to your purpose in the room and what it is that you want to achieve in there. But don't try and own the outcome. If you try and own the outcome, then that can lead to frustration for yourself and can accidentally reinforce that sense of imposter syndrome, because what can happen is you've exited the room and you don't feel as though you've succeeded in what you set out to do. So the active listening part is really important in all of this, in whether it's an informal or formal scenario. So I am going to just touch on other resources now. So I mentioned the Centre for Creative Leadership is really useful for resources. I know that New South Wales faculty is producing podcasts, and we've also got the John Murtagh Library has a leadership section. Brene Brown's work on Daring to Lead is also very useful because it talks about the courage to stand up and get in the arena in order to create change. Professor Michael Kidd, who was RACGP president for 2 terms at a critical juncture in the RACGP's history, has also written a book with, I believe, Professor Leanne Rowe called Every Doctor, which you might find useful too. That has a section on leadership in it that many people find helpful to connect to, as well as an overall perspective on connecting to the profession. So this is now time for questions and answers. So feel free to put some questions in the chat box if you haven't already. And also, as you're thinking about those, you might like to think about where would you want to go next? What have you found useful about this situation in terms of leading, suddenly being a leader? What have you found difficult, and what support would you like from the New South Wales faculty and the RACGP as a whole? But Samantha?
While we're waiting for some questions to come through, we have had a question come through from one of our participants asking if they can find out a bit more about the Future Leader programs and how as GPs, if there's opportunity for them to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just quickly touch on that. The 2021 program applications will be opening, I believe, mid-October, and it is a complementary program that is run for a group of 24 GPs each year. We will be running a webinar just before applications open. So what I would do is I'll provide you, Samantha, with a link to when that webinar is happening. It will also be recorded, so you don't have to join live. That will give an overview, a detailed overview of the content of the Futures Leaders program and what you can expect to get out of it. But we would encourage you to apply. And it's an 8-month program that runs from March until October each year. And we focus on 6 different domains of leadership, from change management through to strategic thinking and also advocacy as some of the key topics. I don't want to take up too much time here, just in case there are other questions.
So there has been mostly voting and questions on how they can be involved in the leadership program and how they can join. So that's great if you're interested in that. Those people that are expressing interest in that in the chat box, once that link is made available to me by Vicky, I will pass it on to those people. So I'll keep a list. So if you're interested, just pop it in the chat box there so I can provide you with that link once it's available. Let's see, okay, so we've got some topics that are coming through for further discussion in the program going forward. So how to overcome change resistance, bringing people along for the ride. Yeah, and we've got a comment about COVID, which is a great one. So COVID has really highlighted to me that I have some qualities that would benefit from improved leadership, but not sure where to go with that. How do you pick a direction? So maybe you can speak to that. How do we focus where we want to go, Vicky?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good question. So it can feel overwhelming. So how do you ensure that you're not overwhelmed by the plethora of directions that you could take? If you have a portfolio career already, so if, for example, you're a GP and you're also doing some medical education and you might also be assuming leadership roles, how do you juggle all of that? And structuring your time is a critical first step in order to be able to do that going forward. delegating to other people if you have that opportunity. Of course, most people are also working from home with kids in the background at the moment, which is particularly challenging. So in terms of choosing direction, it depends on whether this is about what do I do right now? And what I suggest is listing your priorities and putting them in order and then tackling each one at a time. So priority number one, get through that first, and then everything else has to wait. And not burdening yourself or beating yourself up if you can't get to the other things. And your priority at the top should be your priority, not other people's. In terms of direction, if you're talking about longer term and career aspirations, that's certainly something that we're going to be exploring within the college as to how do we support that. But a very useful first step is finding a mentor. Mentors are undoubtedly very useful for being a sounding board, coaching you through scenarios, and if it's an area of clinical interest, helping you to augment your experiences in that area of clinical interest. We also have the Faculty of Specific Interests too, with groups within the RACGP that can drive a lot of support for areas of clinical interest. Whether that's custodial medicine to women's health, for example.
Great. And we've had another question come through. How can you recover from a situation where there may be a need for you as a leader, but previous efforts have not gone well, which you may feel have damaged relationships?
Okay, that's a really good one. So if there are fundamentally some situations in which if relationships have been damaged to the extent that they're impacting on your own mental health, you need to take a step back and decide, is that situation of value for you to be in going forward? If that's the situation, then you need to make a decision from your own perspective. What are your needs? And do you need to consider whether or not this practice is right for you? If it's about how do you reconvene people where relationships have been damaged, or the dynamics are tricky, that you're sort of passing each other on the way to get a cup of tea from the kitchen or coffee, and there's that tension there. First of all, time is great for giving people space and just allowing some of those emotions to settle. Working with a mediator who may be informal, whether that's the practice manager, to have a meeting and discuss what it is that is a challenge at that time, and doing that openly and with compassion and saying, this is what I've noticed. Are you able to enlighten me on what's happened here? Or I'm sensing that you're uncomfortable with what's happened. Would you like to talk more about it? So it really depends on the extent to which the dynamics have been damaged, and it depends on the volume of interaction that you have with those people each day and what you want to do about it going forwards. Always happy to talk about individual scenarios if necessary, while anonymizing them. So that's something that we can also come back to at a later point through podcasts and webinars later down the track.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vicky. I do note that we are just past 7:30. I would like to draw everyone's focus to the slide that is currently up on the screen to help us inform the program of where we would like to go with this. We'd really like to use your insights to do that. So maybe while Vicky is answering another question, if we can get everyone to pop in their thoughts of what they think would be valuable to them moving forward in this space, and also delivery modes of preference as well, whether that be online, face-to-face, podcasts and recordings. We'd really like your insights in those. Just while Vicky, we are getting some responses through on that, there's another question, another good one that's come through. So in an informal situation, if you don't have the agency or power to change the outcomes, how do you approach this when other colleagues are looking to you to be the person to help manage change, whether that be performance managing another member of staff or other things?
Yep. So the performance managing one is always really tricky, where you don't actually have the authority to address it. So the two scenarios: one is where you know there's a performance management issue within the practice and it's impacting on everyone. If you don't have the authority to address it, that's a really tricky one. So you need to engage in conversation with the person who does have the authority to, and explain to them what the impact is. If the impact is such that there's an health and safety issue, for example, you need to reinforce the duty of care responsibilities that go to either the person who is not performing and or the wider team. That is usually the strongest direction to take when you don't have authority and there's a significant issue at play. If you do have the authority, in the sense that you can participate in that discussion, it's really important to offer people the opportunity to respond and go through a due process of performance management. That includes giving clear examples of what's not working, doing that in a way that is positive, and potentially designing a plan with them for a finite period, which articulates what it is they need to achieve and by when. Now, this is with the goal of supporting them to achieve that outcome. And that is what anyone will look for in if you have issues with Fair Work, for example. So this is consistently when I've been involved in performance management issues in the past. I'm an HR practitioner. You always want to be working to best practice and offering people a support person, for example. Now, I would always advocate for getting professional support in for that. So if you're part of a corporate medical group, then you may have human resources support that can support you. You may need to simply escalate the issue to whoever is the medical director or the partners in the practice, or management of the corporate group. But what you want to do is be supported yourself fundamentally through it, so that you know what the requirements are for that person.
That's great. And we have another one that is similar to that question in terms of perhaps you're in a leadership role, but maybe don't have decision-making authority.
Mm-hmm.
I guess around strategies, it can be tricky when you are in a leadership role, if you don't have the power for decision making and the agenda on both sides is different. How would you approach that situation?
So one of the things that there is a book called Influencing Without Authority. The critical first step in that process is going into the interaction assuming that everyone is an ally. This is a really difficult thing for us to do, because we tend to tell ourselves a story driven by that ladder of inference about what's going on and what the other people's motives are, and that will be underpinned by our own values. If you go in believing that there is the potential for everyone to be an ally in the conversation and arrive at a positive outcome, so what can we do to make this work, is a much better starting point than coming in expecting conflict. And it's a perfectly natural response, obviously, to expect conflict, but that mindset shift can be very powerful in creating change where there is no formal line of authority for you to be able to enforce that change. And that applies in any scenario, whether it's within your practice or more widely in your network.
Wonderful. We've got quite a few typing through about what they'd like to see moving forward. We've got one here that is not so much of a question, but a comment that I'm sure a lot of people are feeling. It's from a GP, just stating that if there's a COVID case in the local nursing home, he will be the leader, and just finding all of that a bit daunting. And I think that's probably a very common thing, very common theme at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a number of people put into that situation on the leadership program this year. It may be worth us. So the Future Leaders program is wrapping up in October. And so 2 of what will be are now alumni have been formally put into those roles, particularly working in the nursing home. So there's a potential for us to build a group from there and share information and experiences in small group settings. It's something that we can explore going forward. It is that sense of feeling daunted is consistently articulated by everyone in that scenario. So you're not alone in that respect. It's where you're then able to, who are you able to lean on for support in order to maintain your own well-being going forward and get the information that you need that's critical.
That's fantastic. It is at 7:40, so we will wrap up now. I just want to thank everybody that's sending through their comments. We will be actively using your feedback and thoughts to help us shape the program of where we want this to go, and also delivery modes of what you find preferable. So thank you very much. And if anything comes to mind after the webinar ends, please email them through to us. We are really interested to hear from you, and we hope to see you at the next events that we run on this topic. We will notify you once they are available, as you've attended this one. And for those also that have sent through that they want that link to the program, I know I haven't responded to all of you to confirm, but I will add you all to the list and send that out to you once it's available. So I would like to thank Vicky again so much for joining us and presenting to us tonight, to Anne, and also to everybody that joined us online. Well, that brings us to the end. So thank you and good night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good night.